In that case, good afternoon and welcome to the East Bay Regional Park District's Board Legislative Committee meeting of Friday, June 26th. Pursuant to Governor Newsom's executive order and the Alameda County Public Health Department officers' current shelter-in-place order, we're holding this meeting via teleconference, video conferencing. We welcome members of the public to attend. The method with which to do that is we welcome you to listen to the live stream on the Park District's YouTube channel. I think the best way to get to that would be go to the East Bay Regional Park District website, ebparks.org, and look under the committee meeting, and it'll direct you to the YouTube channel, or I think you could probably get it just through YouTube. If you have any public comments, there are a couple of ways to do that, and that is to email to ypadmore, Y-P-A-D-M-O-R-E @ebparks.org. You can email your comments or by voicemail by calling 510-544-2002. If you have any difficulty with doing that, Yuli Padmore is available, and you can reach her at, again, 510-544-2002. So we'll begin the meeting by welcome everyone. Do we usually call roll at this to let everybody know who's here, Yuli?
Yes, we do.
Would you do that, please?
Absolutely. So let's start with Director Beverly Lane.
Present.
We have Director Elizabeth Eccles joining via audio.
I'm here, thanks.
General Manager Robert Doyle.
Present.
Chief Government and Legislative Affairs Eric Feeler.
Here.
Legislative and Policy Analyst Lisa Baldinger.
Here.
And our advocates, Doug Houston.
Present.
And that's our state advocate. Federal advocate Peter Umhofer.
Here.
And of course, we have Director Dennis Waspy, the chair of the Board Legislative Committee meeting for Friday, June 26th.
Thank you, Yuli. We're all present and accounted for. So we'll move right into state legislation. And Eric or Doug, do you want to go with that?
Eric, like me to launch?
Sure.
Excellent. So I've established a bit of an inferiority complex because typically all the good news is coming out of California, but now with the Land and Water Conservation discussions and Great American Outdoors Act and the possible derailing of a bond here in California, kudos to Peter and the folks back in DC for doing some good conservation work. But in the meantime, on item 1 here, AB 2076, the bill was introduced by a Republican in Frank Bigelow, Vice Chair of Appropriations, one of the few Republican bills that got out of appropriations this year. And it looks to require the Department of Parks and Recreation, their director, to establish a wildfire prevention strategy. There isn't really a comprehensive wildfire prevention strategy that's been developed thus far within state parks, and the priorities associated with the strategy would be looking at properties and activities to reduce fire, primarily in high and very high fire severity zones. So as your summary notes, this bill, if it is enacted, would have the possibility ultimately to have some impacts on Del Val and Mount Diablo and potentially Marsh Creek, as they would be captured theoretically within the context of the new wildfire prevention strategy. So comments?
Any questions, comments?
I would just add, this was an issue that Supervisor Diane Burgess raised with the district and with Senator Glazer with regard to the Marsh Creek State Park, with the fact that there was no plan and they don't do grazing on state parks, so there's no fuel reduction plan in place. And so this is, I don't think this is a response to that specific request, but this would address those concerns that she had and others had. And I know Director Coffey had some interest in that as well.
General Manager Doyle.
Yeah, just not to be critical at all, Eric, but actually the Marsh Creek Historic State Park did get an exception to the grazing rule and is grazed. So if Diane believes that, Supervisor Burgess believes it isn't, it has been grazed and continues to be grazed. But we know that the others, particularly Mount Diablo, has a fire about every other year. And that impacts us as well, since we surround it with 5 parks. So just a comment there. Doug, is there any funding going to state parks to do these studies or to implement anything? How are they actually getting the work done?
I seem to recall reading the analysis that the study would be predicated on funding being forthcoming. It would need to be an appropriation in a future budget, because I think the activity is somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 million. So it's putting, if it goes forward, policies in place, and then future budget years when things are a little bit more rosy, then theoretically they could plunk some money in there and get going on some of the activities.
Thank you.
Any further board member comments? Elizabeth, you'll have to vocally raise your hand if you would, because we can't see you if you have a comment.
Here.
Hearing none, I have just a question, and I support this, but we always refer to, and it's, so this is the State Parks Agency, which will develop and implement the prevention strategy. I assume CAL FIRE probably has a strategy, and so do we. And I'm interested in this. It's the jurisdiction located within a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Who makes those zones? Is it insurance companies? Is it CAL FIRE? Or where can I get a copy of this? I know my neighbors claim they're getting their insurance canceled at the time based on that, but who's making up the rules, or who makes this? Who designates the high or very high fire?
In terms of who makes the rules, that's CAL FIRE, or the board, not the Board of Forestry, that's CAL FIRE. There is considerable mapping out there, Dennis. There's a lot of tools and sources out there where you can identify high and very high fire severity zones. And yes, that has a tendency to trigger policies and activities around insurance and homeowners insurance, and how much, and who's eligible, who's not eligible.
All right, thank you very much. So if there's no further discussion, I think, as you remember in our last meeting, we were going to take these state legislation recommendations to support and send to the full board, and we're going to treat them as a consent calendar item. So we're going to do 4 bills that were recommended to support. And at the end of that, we'll vote yay or nay instead of taking the time to go with each one. And then we'll do the same thing with the bills that we're asked to watch. So if there are no further questions, we'll move right down to AB 2519.
Dennis, Lisa just put in the chat box information about how you can access the severity, the high severity.
And very high.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I saw that. I haven't had a chance to respond, but thank you, Lisa.
Good job, thank you. So Dennis, on item 2, Director Waspy, this bill, it piggybacks on an effort from a few years ago. Then Senator Lara, who's now our insurance commissioner, advanced a piece of legislation, I think it was SB 255, that sought to permit advance payment primarily to disadvantaged communities in the state of California around projects that stem from what is the Integrated Regional Watershed Management Program that came out of Prop 84. And I think there was some successes yielded through, providing upfront some funding primarily to some of these communities that couldn't work on a reimbursement basis, NGOs in particular, and disadvantaged communities. So this bill is looking to reestablish that model and allow for grants pursuant to the Resources Agency, State Coastal, and then the State Water Resources Control Board. Allow those grants and recipients of those grants to apply for advance payment. And as the summary notes, the district, I don't think this is specific to disadvantaged communities. So if need be, the district could then apply for advance payment under those agencies.
All right, any questions, comments on that? Hearing none, we'll move on to AB 3074.
Sure. Assemblymember Laura Friedman, she's the chair of Natural Resources Committee on the Assembly side. She's been very, very active on fire policy in the state of California. She has a very, very knowledgeable, skilled staff that's been assisting her in this area. And this bill just sort of puts a new defensible overlay for defensible space. Right now it's 100 feet. What's being proposed in this bill is to create an ember resistant zone that is 5 feet from properties, again, in high or very high fire severity zones. As the analysis notes that embers do travel, and oftentimes homes ignite, primarily because embers that land adjacent to near homesteads in these areas in the state. So that's the piece of legislation.
Questions, comments? Member Lane.
So is there anything on the books now from the state that requires defensible space being set up, or does it just widen the space that need to do? Or is this a new bill on the whole thing?
Yeah, so there is something on the books, and I was under the impression in terms of defensible space on properties that are higher, very high, that it was 30 feet. I don't know. Regardless, this particular policy, if it's enacted, would need to go to the Board of Forestry to be for rulemaking purposes, to establish what does an ember resistant zone look like, what's permissible in those areas, what's not permissible. So this is just more enabling legislation, and then we flush out some of the details through the Board of Forestry. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, well, that's okay. I wouldn't oppose it, but for them to say 100 feet and then to say embers travel miles seems orderly to me.
Any other questions, comments? Hearing none, we'll move to AB 3164.
Sure. Again, and as noted, Assemblymember Friedman's been very, very active on fire policy previous years and this year in particular, and she's been advancing. She's had the good fortune of advancing a couple bills, and this bill would create a wildfire risk model, and again look in high and very high fire severity zones, working in cooperation with an advisory group, the insurance commissioner, to identify areas of the state that can fit into this category, and to begin to establish policies around what that wildfire risk model would look like moving forward.
All right, questions, comments on that?
And Doug, I would just add that the bill does have a provision for an oversight committee
Right.
with the agencies, and as part of that oversight committee, there are representatives from the insurance industry included. So it's a little bit at what Dennis was speaking to earlier about who's deciding.
Yeah, good comment.
All
Okay.
right, if there's no further comments, I'm going to propose that we take these 4 bills that were recommended to the full board for support, and we can vote on these in a packet or sort of as a consent calendar item. Member Eccles, do you have a comment, question?
You're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I do have a question. So, and sorry if I missed it, but just looking again at the description of the prior bill that we were just talking about, I just want to make sure that I fully understand. So the existing law is there's 100 feet defensible space around dwellings. But this is an additional 5 foot, or what exactly is it proposing in terms of the Ember Zone?
So without going into detail on the analysis, what I suspect is being proposed is there is a defensible space zone. Essentially, you're supposed to do a lot of clearing around your properties. But in the case of this 5 foot zone, it's probably an elevated risk reduction policy that they're going to be proposing, where whatever the case may be, maybe you can't plant decorative plants around that 5 foot zone. I just haven't gone into the analysis to understand completely what the crux of the policy is, but I suspect that's probably what they're talking about.
I see. So you would maintain the 100 feet, but then in this 5 feet around your home, it would be a sort of a higher standard of defensible space, basically. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and just usually what's required is that you have to limb up shrubbery within that zone. This is, I think, within the fire department language. We used to, I think, Dennis called it a coal line zone, where it actually has to be down to soil.
Probably
So
be denuding the
additional
property.
restrictions.
Yeah, denuding or even gravel or whatever the case may be.
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think my place up in Cedar Ridge, I know the latest requirement is I used to stack firewood under my deck. I thought it was a good idea, but I don't think that's going to work anymore. I know that they considered that 100 foot zone, the zone by your home could have 4 inches of grass, whatever. I think it's going to be asphalt or some kind of hardscape. And maybe, I don't even, in this 5 foot space, I don't know how it will be defined, but I'm wondering if siding on your home is considered, well, what is it? That consider your structure, or 5 feet? I don't know how they'll do it, but it'll just be another level of protection, or
Agreed.
making your cabin look like a downtown hotel. But who knows? So anyway, if there are
well, it's just very, very interesting. Even in the Berkeley Hills and Oakland and up in the mountains, people will limb their trees up. They're supposed to have a clearance, but then you see many, many places that have their wood stacked against the house. And it's kind of an oddity, because you want to keep your wood dry. So that's where your eaves are. So a lot of people do that. I think this is probably a very important, that in itself is very important, to pull the firewood well away from any flammable structure. But we'll get more detail on that to the board.
All right, so we have been asked to recommend to the full board these 4 bills. Do I have a motion to do that?
So moved.
Second.
A motion by Member Eccles and a second by Member Lane. Any further discussion, or Yuli, has anybody called in or wanted to talk about this from the public? Okay, hearing none. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to the items that are recommended to watch. And that would be SB 1300.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Chair. I don't know if I want to go into a whole lot of detail in this bill because the RDA stuff is incredibly complicated. Suffice it to say, I think what the bill was intended to do, and it's not going to advance, it got held on appropriations. It's just allow the city of Hercules and its RDA agency to sort of restructure its existing obligation to try to mitigate some of the effects of the dissolution of redevelopment back in 2011. They're still suffering from the impacts associated with that. And I think this is just a piece of legislation to help mitigate some of the pain for the city of Hercules. It did garner some opposition. It would have had some negligible impacts to the district, slight reduction of property taxes, but bigger than that, it had, and reading through the analysis, it would have redirected somewhere nearly $10 million from the state general fund. And that would have had a direct impact on schools and required the state through its Prop 98 obligations to backfill that loss. So just the cost alone was problematic. And this isn't the first attempt. There's been other legislation, similar legislation in the past, and both of those bills were vetoed. So I don't think this is any surprise to anybody.
Doug, I agree. I just wanted to mention that we were asked to look at this bill by the California Special Districts Association, given they feel that doing anything that dissolves a finding of completion of an RDA is a bad precedent. And I think they're right about that, but they wanted to check with us because obviously Senator Skinner was on our board and is in our region. So they wanted our feedback on the bill, which we provided. But because CSDA took an opposition position, and also because, as Doug, you correctly note, that it's not going to advance this year, we did want the board to be aware that it was out there and it was proposed, and that we were asked to take a look at it.
And Dennis, this may be a good time now that we fully have Elizabeth back, Director Eccles back. That it probably would be good to have an update to the board on the dissolution of the redevelopment agencies, because we sit on some of those. So I think maybe we should ask Finance Department to give the board an update, whether it should come here or another committee. I think it'd be good an update because several of our board members were appointed to those committees, and I'm not sure where the status is. Some of them have been completely closed down already, but some of them, like Hercules and several others. Hercules established a very large redevelopment area for that shoreline portion of the city. And so I'm sure that infrastructure was probably all paid for in debt related to the redevelopment agency. So they are probably carrying a sizable debt there. But we should give an update to the board on, because there were other ones as well. And I think, Dennis, I'm not sure if you sat on one for Hayward.
Yeah, Union City.
Yeah,
Union City.
Yeah, so we'll be good to give the board an update.
And I think that's a good idea because it wasn't clear in my mind if Colin was aware of this effort. So we need to make him aware. Right. Well. I think Ted Radke was on the committee when it went through.
All right, any questions, comments on this? Hearing none, let's move to SB 1431.
Sure, this is introduced by Senator Glazer. And the bill sought to permit for the reassessment of properties and property taxes if a property owner could make a claim that there was damage or destruction as a result of COVID to that property. I think where there's sort of a departure in existing law, constitutional law, is counties generally permit property owners to do this when there is physical damage or destruction. In reading through the analysis and having an exchange with Lisa and Eric, I think this bill seeking primarily to help to bailout's not the right word, but to mitigate the effects of rent freezes for multifamily property owners throughout the state of California, who are not getting paid, but they continue to have to pay their mortgages and insurance and the like. The bill, while that was the intent of the bill, the analysis goes into detail on what the overall effects could be through the result of the enactment of this bill, and it could, have pretty far-reaching effects to restaurants, manufacturing, and which translates into theoretically billions of dollars in losses, property tax losses to the state of California if implemented. So naturally, through appropriations, they sought to hold this bill, just cost alone.
I have a quick question.
Member Eccles.
Thank you. And Doug, so I understand this is sort of a special, more urgent reassessment, but don't the county assessors have an obligation anyway to reassess when the property values go down? I mean, I remember that happened in 2008 recession. There was a reassessment. So I'm just wondering how this fits in with that.
They do. Yeah, absolutely. But those were based on just sort of natural property tax value fluctuations, the downward fluctuation. In this case, I don't know if we're going to see that immediately. And, a year from now, 2 years from now, we could see reductions in our property taxes. But what's permissible in current law is if a property owner, if there is damage, if there is fire, and a property is destroyed, you as a property owner could go to your county assessor and say, I need this reassessed because it obviously doesn't have the value it once had. So what this bill is seeking to do is say, because of COVID, folks, I need to get a reassessment because I can't collect rents. So there's I'm being economically damaged.
Right.
But knowing the Constitution, does that permit that? So.
Okay, thank you.
And I think this would only be possible if a governor declares an emergency. We were asked to take a look at this bill as well by CSDA, and we ran it by finance. And when we all looked at it, we weren't even sure that it was specific to apartment buildings. It seemed like it meant everything, which would be a huge impact to the district. So, but because it's Senator Glazer, we wanted to put it on the agenda as a watch for now, knowing that the bill is being held in committee and it's not advancing.
All right. Any further questions, comments? In that case, we've completed our the recommended bills for watch, and I will accept the motion to recommend to the full board watching these.
So move.
We have a motion by Member Lane
Second.
and a second by Member Eccles. Yuli, do we have anybody that wants to comment on that from the public?
No public comment.
Okay. Thank you. Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
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 The motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. And now we get to the fun part, the June 15, 2020 state budget.
Are you being sarcastic, Dennis?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
So, so there's a word in the summary, it's stopgap. I think that's sort of the operative word. I did have the good fortune of, I had a nice conversation yesterday Laura Friedman, who was the author of a couple of the bills that we supported today at length. And, my first question I asked her, I said, are you going to be able to vote for this budget with a straight face tomorrow? And she said, they're hopeful. But again, everything is predicated on Peter's good work back in DC and making sure that the state of California receives its $10 to $12 billion in discretionary dollars, by the way, to make sure that some of these cuts don't take place. But as your summary points out, there's a little bit of gimmickry associated with school funding. They're going to be postponing some payments to the schools and allowing them to use reserves and short-term loans, and then reimburse school entities across the state. The 10% cut in state employee compensation is obviously going to be helpful. And again, along the lines of sort of kicking the can, they really avoided a lot of tough cuts. And I'm not complaining. I know Eric and Robert aren't complaining, because particularly in the natural resources area, literally everything that was in the governor's original budget, with some exceptions, everything that was negotiated out was very, very favorable for state parks, for California Natural Resources, for Fish and Wildlife. There was a proposed base reduction of $30 million, both the state parks and Fish and Wildlife. Those were rejected. The governor had proposed defunding a new program under AB 209 for nature education at $20 million. That was, the legislature elected to continue to fund that. If there was any casualty on the natural resources side of things, the $20 million for a new state park was reduced to $5 million. But again, it's my understanding in talking to Ms. Freeman yesterday, the legislature is already ramping up for further negotiations and discussions come week 1 or 2 of August. There are there are trailer bills that are beginning to be drafted around the various policy areas in the budget, including natural resources. And I suspect they probably will underscore some of the cuts that are just being delayed right now and will actually need to be triggered come August to have a true balanced budget. So, any questions?
I'll add.
Oh yeah, Eric, please.
Summary. There's a couple different pieces, and I think Peter will get to the federal piece of it later. But the tax payments were delayed till July 15th this year. The Republicans aren't really looking to act on the HEROES Act, which had the $1 trillion in local and state assistance that would support the governor's revised budget. The Republicans in the Senate are holding off on that until unemployment benefits extension expires at the end of July. So sometime in July, we'll probably start to see numbers that are a little more real. But really, I think what Doug is indicating is that this is going to be a process, through August and throughout the fall. And given the current resurgence of the virus, it's hard to know what that's going to really look like for the economy again. So these are obviously very unprecedented times and very hard to know. But I think our fear, and Doug's on it, is just, right now, this is kind of we're playing with last year's money. I think once we start to really get into this and see the impacts, all bets are off. And so we're going to have to be very vigilant on, our base budget funding and anything that could come at us from Sacramento. The one thing that I will add that I think is a positive on the budget currently is that we have secured the funding that we were a little concerned about with regard to McOsker. So we should be okay on that project and our other grant programs. So But this is definitely, I think Doug said it, kicked the can down the road kind of budget. And I think some real tough decisions are going to need to be made in the fall very soon.
A quick comment from the GM. We do know that the resurgence in the virus affecting California as well as the nation very severely right now is going to have a further negative impact on any recovery for the economy. So this budget may be kicking the can down the road, but it certainly isn't kicking the virus down the road. And so we know that we're going to be further restricted and further economic impacts from that. So we really have to be vigilant, as Eric said. Doug, just a question for you. Was there any discussion in this negotiation of just shifting the sources of money? Like in the past, a lot of times cuts would get shifted to a bond measure or delay a bond measure, going out to a bond sale. And any discussions, because that's some of the first discussions they usually have. So we're not even there yet.
Yeah, no, because some of the activities we're talking about, you can't really pay for out of a bond.
Right.
Like, reductions in baseline funding for operations for those agencies. But I seem to recall, and for your grant department, and I'll get clarification at some point in next week. I think that they are expediting the release of some of the bond funds around some of the programs out of 68 in advance of what was anticipated. So we need to be poised and ready to go. We have, the regional park program, we have the revenue enhancement programs. And so I just bring that to everybody's attention.
And Doug, maybe should we share the information about per capita?
Well, I was going to leave that up to you and Robert, but yeah, we did. So State Parks finally did their final analysis of how the per capita program through Prop 68 was going to be allocated. And it wasn't much of a surprise to me necessarily, but at least for the park district, we are going to be receiving $4.625 million, which is a nice sum of money. I think what we learned through this allocation analysis is how flawed per capita was in Prop 68, as I was articulating as we were trying to advocate for it, because on the city side of the distributions, the city of Los Angeles will be receiving the same amount as the city of Colfax. So I don't know how well that speaks to the per capita program going forward. I think we're going to be losing some of our big advocates if we can't do a better job in making sure that it's true population-based formula. But so I thought we'd just share some of that, and thanks for the entree there, Eric.
And that is very confusing. I'm not sure how, Doug, you and I can have an offline discussion how that actually happened, because if it's per capita, that's based on population, and clearly the city side was not based on population. I just want to say that this was one of our major pushes in Prop 68 that we all worked on so hard. I even went up and down the state. I went down to Los Angeles. I don't think I'll be invited down to Los Angeles parks anymore. But to advocate for per capita, because our biggest argument in pushing per capita is some of the big cities, including Los Angeles, already said, well, it's not enough for us to really worry about and to get on board with. So this is not helpful. But I'm really happy that the district did well, because we were the champion. We were the statewide champion, and we had to convince members of CPRS, which Doug worked very hard on, and a lot of other cities that per capita, including San Francisco, which I had some very interesting conversations with Mr. Ting, member Ting in the city, on those bills. And so I'm really glad this is a very important piece of grant funding for us right now. And remember, it's discretionary to how we use that. It's not for just acquisition or just natural resources. The board gets to decide the priority for that use. And it's going to be critically important for completing some of our projects that we don't have other funds for. So you'll have a fun time debating that issue, but we're really glad, because I think weren't the estimates, Lisa, anywhere from 3 to 5, something like that. So we're upper end of that. And so, but I just want to remind the board that this was something that we worked day and night to argue that it was worth fighting for, because it wasn't just would we get it. We had to convince our own profession that they need to get on board with that, because they really hadn't seen any per capita for a very, very long time. So I really thank the team and Doug for all that effort.
Well, and Bob, to that point, there were a lot of legislators that had never seen per capita. I think maybe only Hertzberg was the only one around that had seen that kind of a bond before. So we had a lot of education to do, and Bob's leadership was really important in that. And frankly, I don't think it would have happened without you, Bob.
Well, it was a team effort.
Okay, so I do have a question. I don't want us to get too far into the weeds, but you're right. I mean, we're not going to get, I don't know what happened with San Francisco's per capita, but it's important to have LA supporting future bonds with per capita. So can you give me or us some idea about why this turns out to be so inequitable?
Sure.
Before we dive into that, Doug, I would like to bring it back to the board to have that discussion based off of the way the grant criteria was developed. So for instance, the city of Hayward a portion would have gone to HARD. And so that money's still going to Hayward, but not to the city of Hayward. And so I would like to look at all of the different entities within the Los Angeles city who received a portion of that sum and look at the total sum that was invested into Los Angeles. So though the city of Los Angeles may have received a smaller sum, the area of Los Angeles and the districts within it would have received additional funding. And so I would like to look at that holistic package before we dive too far into that discussion, and I have not yet.
And Lisa, that's a very important point. As Doug knows, the county of Los Angeles has a very huge park system. And so that also has that population in LA for that park system. So I think that is the issue. I think the cities did not do as well, but I think, Doug, the special districts and counties did better.
The regionals and counties did great.
Okay.
The cities did not.
We
I'll defer to you, Lisa. I mean, on sharing what you need to share with your board members around how the money was allocated. It's fine.
Okay, well, then that doesn't sound quite so crazy. If you talk about the total amount that went everywhere in LA County, then it's probably closer to per capita, right? Sort of. I hope so.
Well,
Right, and so we'll look into that.
And again, remember, for San Francisco, they are a city and county. So that's it. They are the board of supervisors as well as the mayor. So we'll do additional research on this. But there was a lot of other interpretation going on, I think Doug would say. And Doug did. I will just speak up for Doug, whether he wants to or not. But he saw this coming and did express his concern to parks, state parks.
Now, so I have a question then about per capita distribution in the East Bay to the smaller park districts, which we have in the East Bay. Are they receiving any money, or are we receiving all of the per capita money for the total population of the two counties?
For East Bay, the way Prop 68 per capita funding broke out is county and in cities. And so cities, so LARPD and HARD, they were divided out of the city bucket with Livermore, with Hayward. The East Bay Regional Park District received the total sum for Alameda and Contra Costa County level grants. And we're working with the counties to move that forward. And so we received the total sum for the counties. The other smaller districts that are within a city entity worked with the cities to come up with an equitable split within their jurisdiction.
This is probably important for Elizabeth as well, because there's a very long history here. Some of it very positive for the district, but also painful, is that because Alameda and Contra Costa County do not have a county-wide park system, we are their park system. And Doug will recall, this goes all the way back to Dick Trudeau and some in the past, and some very strong leaning towards the park district of how much money we would get versus others. And so this time there was a distribution to others, but because basically it's different because we are the county system. So we get that full count. I think that's correct, Doug. But there's
I would say that the formula created, which I did not create, was more liberal in allocating funds to a number of new entities in the state of California, which resulted in less funds to the big people. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Interesting. But this has gone back probably to bond measures all the way back in the 70s, when who gets counted in that population and who receives it. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I am sure we will be hearing from some of our friends in other agencies. I think, Beverly, you will recall that there were a lot of discussions with Contra Costa County on the service districts for our own measures about, well, who's getting that share of the money, and we agreed that we would work with them. That was a big charge for Jeff Rasmussen's in our grants department to try to figure that out, because they realized that, well, wait, we didn't get the county service districts did not get a chunk. It went through us and to us. So I'm sure there could be further conversations there in the future.
And is that the case with this as well?
Pardon me?
Is that the case with this as well?
I can chime in. When I was in the acting grants manager, we were contracted by Contra Costa County, and I see Jeff just unmuted himself, and maybe he can give us an update there.
Yeah,
everybody. This is Jeff Rasmussen, and we did have to negotiate with Contra Costa County. As Doug Houston mentioned, it's all across the state. The state parks has to determine their final allocations with each agency, and they do that kind of all at one time. That's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. And during that process, we had to concede about a population of about 5,000 people to Contra Costa County as a small part of the share we're not going to get. So we still got 4.6 million, and I don't have the exact figure for the 5,000 people, but we did have to negotiate with Contra Costa County.
And Alameda County?
No, not with Alameda County at all. We got all of Alameda County, every bit of it.
Oh, okay. Were they not as alert as Contra Costa, or?
They don't have CSDs.
Exactly. Robert's talking about the CSDs.
Right.
Okay.
See, this is fun.
Wow.
Eric, you
Thanks.
had
I'll unmute. So interesting conversation. Any other comments on that? We were talking about the state budget, but the 68 item was very interesting. Any other comments? Hearing none, let's move to the climate jobs bond.
Yeah, thank you. We've had several discussions about the prospect of a bond moving forward. Included in the governor's January budget was a $4.8 billion debt instrument, primarily for climate resiliency and adaptation. Legislature's been working closely with the administration to try to frame up and reconcile priorities between the legislature and the administration around what a bond should look like. A lot of good positive discussion up until COVID. It was voted, the May revise, the governor elected to drop the bond from the budget. The legislature, in its approval of their own budget package on June 15th, did not include a bond as well. In theory, 3256 is alive, as there is another vehicle, SB 45, that can continue to be a vehicle moving forward for a bond. But what's growing more and more problematic is some of the deadlines associated with advancing a bond, and advancing a bond in the context of a mail-in ballot year, because it's accelerated a lot of the timetables required of the Secretary of State to put together the ballot information. So really, I mean, today was kind of a drop dead date to get a bond through the legislature onto the governor's desk and onto the November ballot. What I've discussed with Eric and I think Lisa is there may be a possibility that when they come back and need to rework the budget, that they may need to send something along to the voters, they being the legislature, a tax increase, not sure, I'm just speculating, in which case they would need to put together a supplemental ballot, the legislature, and there's a possibility that the bond may piggyback onto that, but I'm only speculating. I have not heard that. And again, my discussion with Laura Friedman yesterday, who is one of the principal authors of 3256, she didn't sound terribly optimistic. So we're all kind of looking to 2021 to reboot this effort and get something up and running.
Comments, questions?
Hmm.
That's a shame, but
I think Lisa was going to comment maybe on the regional effort, and then I had an additional comment later.
Yeah, I was just going to
Great.
speak to Together Bay Area, formerly known as the Bay Area Open Space Council, has been working together. They've created a policy subcommittee. We're working with Mid-Peninsula Open Space, Santa Clara Open Space, and many others. And so through the cultivated efforts of Shalana De Silva, their policy director, we were able to get some Bay Area specific requests through Assemblymember Mullins' office and to the author. And so though it's not advancing forward, we are continuing that effort and that conversation for regional benefit with our peers and colleagues at other agencies.
And my additional comment was going to be sort of twofold. One is that because of what's happened with the economy and thinking about a bond related to jobs, and when we get to federal pieces, looking at jobs on the infrastructure package, it's gotten us to examine how we look at our projects. And so Lisa's actually managing a project with Beacon Economics and our finance and DECO departments to have real numbers that we can quantify future projects with. So we know for past projects like the Dotson Family Marsh behind Director Eccles's window there, that created 431 jobs outside of the Park District. Bay Point, 200 jobs, Pinole Shores Bridge, 177 jobs. So we want to be able to use statistics like that for future projects and shovel ready projects, so that when there is funding for either infrastructure or a climate bond, that we have the data and we are in the position to make a strong argument for our projects, through whether it be through grants or direct allocations. So for just to get the momentum behind that, this has been a positive exercise. And the other thing I was just going to say is that, you know, it shouldn't have taken as long as it did, but I don't know, Doug, I think you were starting to talk about a park bond in 2012 and it took till 2018 to get on the ballot. So these things do take time to, you know, advance. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the last year, even despite COVID, in advancing another bond that's resource related. So I think it may be next year, but I do think we've made some really good progress. So we should keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Good comments.
And Dennis, just wanted to acknowledge, in case the board isn't fully aware of it, that Lisa is on the board of the organization formerly known as the Open Space Council, because I don't think every board member knows that name yet. So I want to thank Lisa for her advocacy and work there, because that's a barrier-wide coalition, so really helpful with our delegation. So thank you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Any other questions on AB 3256? Comments? Hearing none, let's move on to the split roll ballot initiative.
Okay, so come November, there's going to be an initiative on the ballot. I think most of us have already heard about this, and this has been discussed for quite some time. It's a bit of a nuclear option, and it's obviously going to be a very expensive campaign on both fronts. So what this initiative is intending to do is to require the reassessment of all commercial retail properties in the state of California based on today's values. Pursuant to Proposition 13, we established there was an established base, and entities, there was never a reassessment of value other than an annual adjustment, unless there were some sizable improvements to those properties, and then the improvement would trigger a reassessment, not of the larger property, but only of that improvement. So what this initiative is intending to do, again, is to trigger an entire reassessment of commercial retail properties in the state of California, would generate in the magnitude of about $12 billion annually. A sizable amount would go to local agencies. And as the summary points out, in doing an analysis, there's a possibility that if it's approved, about $20 million in new revenues would be directed toward the Park District in property taxes. So that's what we got going. Eric, maybe you want to speak to a little bit of the politics that we talked about yesterday.
Sure. So on one hand, there would be a benefit for the district with additional revenue. But on the other hand, it's not clear to me where this will be headed in terms of margin of success. As Doug pointed out, there'll be a lot of money thrown at it against it. Some of our largest employers and landowners, such as Chevron and other Clorox and other companies in the East Bay, would be impacted, and they are also represented on our foundation board. So the reason we wanted to bring this to people's attention is to make sure that everybody knew all the information about both the initiative and both how it could impact the district in both directions. And so at this time, we were simply putting it out there as an informational item and hope to keep monitoring it and see how likely it is to progress. And I mean, it is going to be on the ballot, but I don't know if there'll be a lot of money behind it per se. So, and there's going to be a lot of things on the ballot this year. And there's also going to be a lot of people with a lot less, businesses are going to be hurting. And so I think the political dynamic will be very challenging for this particular initiative.
And the board may recall that we've had bills through the legislature. I think even Senator Skinner had a bill on the same concept. And a lot of this discussion over the years has been happening as the economy ramped up to be a very robust economy. And so now with COVID, it's gone in the other direction. So the timing really isn't squared because I think there was a very big argument that commercial property was not being properly assessed, and they're making lots of money, and gee, this is a good time to do that. I think your campaign is definitely, all these businesses are hurting. and that's hurting employment. So is this a time to punch them in the gut? So I think that's, you can just see that campaign being rolled out right now, because you're seeing it even without anything on taxation in all the communities in the nation now, about how much businesses are hurting. And they're not really talking about the businesses, they're talking about the employees who work for those businesses. So it's going to be you may actually have a split, perhaps not on organized labor, but you could have a split on employees who are thinking more about the impact on their jobs. So there's going to be yet another job debate. And I really can see that happening with this. So it's tough.
Board members, any questions, comments?
Well, this discussion's been going on for 40 years, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
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 I would just add on I certainly appreciate the comments about employment, and I think that will be the case that's made, but that at the same time, with pending cuts to the schools and community colleges and others, I think that would be the flip side of the argument, right? That the schools are also hurting community colleges. So it's going to be, but I agree, it's going to be tough either way. So.
Yeah, there certainly, you're absolutely right, Director Eccles, that there's certainly an argument that this is a time when services are going to be cut because of the economy, and that's direct tax income into agencies. So you're already seeing that agencies are having to cut jobs and cut back drastically. So this is going to be a very dynamic debate for sure.
All right. Yeah, dynamics the word I was going to looking for. Doug, do you happen to know? I'm sure there's been some polling done. What's it look like at this point?
I haven't seen anything, Dennis. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Generally, PPIC and others, you might see some polling. I typically monitor that. I just haven't seen anything. And if I'll after the call, I'll do a little research, and if I find anything, I'll share it with Eric.
All right. Thank you very much. So if there's nothing else, that's the state. Any other matters from the state? Anyone would like to bring up? Any members of the public? Yuli? Hearing none. Doug, thanks very much. Have a great weekend. And you're welcome to stay, of course.
I'll listen in for a little while. I'm interested to hear what Peter has to say. So if you don't mind.
Oh, great. Good. Excellent. All right. We'll move to federal legislation.
Mr. Chairman, before Doug signs off, I think it might be of interest to the board to kind of get his sense of the actual Capitol and what's going on there. I had a conversation with him the other day that, most of the time our advocates are in the Capitol. So if you're interested, I'd ask Doug to say, you can tell he's at home.
No, without a doubt. That'd be great.
I'm in Cave Junction, Oregon right now.
Oh, good for you.
So it's I don't like to use the term surreal. It's been difficult and challenging. No one is permitted to go into the Capitol unless they're there to testify on legislation before a policy committee. And even in those cases, they're holding these policy committee hearings in the largest committee rooms that generally hold 400 plus, and they're only permitting up to 25 people in the hearing rooms for all the legislation. There's no interpersonal contact. Legislators are permitted to have one staffer in the office per day. It's been daunting. It's been frustrating in a lot of instances. I would say that if this were a typical year with the typical volume of legislation that they generally produce, it would be impossible for anybody to do their job. But fortunately, because of COVID and some of the dictates that came down from leadership about calling their individual legislative portfolios, it's made things a little more manageable. But even still, my routine when pre-COVID was spending a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours over in the Capitol on a daily basis, going into the individual offices, talking to staff. And you just don't have that luxury right now. And what's more challenging is I'm not getting return phone calls as much because I guess there's no sense of urgency. So I'm doing my best, folks. Fortunately, there's not a whole lot that's really critical to the district that's advancing right now. But it's been frustrating. Thanks for allowing me to share that, Bob.
Yeah, I think it's important. That context is pretty unique. I've never seen, even in really tough times, never seen anything like that in such a bit. And I'm sure Elizabeth knows as well as the other board members, how busy it usually is in the Capitol. Long lines and everything else. This is just really a very different reality. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for everything you're trying to do.
And I think we'll
Thanks
probably,
for sharing, Doug.
I think we'll probably get to this when Peter speaks too, but there's a similar dynamic in Washington. And I would say also just for our local work, we're not going to mayor's conferences. We're not going to luncheons or events where we're going to run into the electeds and have a 5-minute, conversation with them. They're not hosting events like that. So it has, I was telling somebody this the other day, that it has really altered the work model for this type of work. And so, yes, I appreciate, Doug, you trying to get through to it. I mean, some places you can't even, Yuli's trying to schedule stuff with folks and you can't even get them on a phone, and we don't have everybody's personal cell phone number. So it has impacted the way we do our work, and we are plugging through it and we're getting stuff done, but it is just, it's a different world for everybody, but it is a different world for this type of more human to human work. So thanks, Doug, and thanks, Peter, for what you guys are both doing.
Yep.
Thank you. So moving to federal legislation, our first bill is HR 2199.
So I guess I'll start. Peter, please fill in if there's any detail that I miss. And for the first two bills on the list, these came to us actually by a comment from Director Rosario. This committee and the board approved the Public Lands Act by Senator Harris, and that bill had 3 House companion bills folded into one Senate bill. And so the main bill that the district was interested dealt with redwoods and redwood parks up in the coast, but also would have some impact in our own redwood park. And so we took a position on that particular bill, and Director Rosario wondered why we wouldn't just take a position on the other two, since they are consistent. And indeed they are. They just don't directly impact the park district as much. But the Central Coast Heritage Act and the San Gabriel Mountains Act basically are wilderness and wild and scenic river designations, which are among the higher designations that you can enact at the federal level. So it would put more land in both regions into protective status. And they both have the support of some of our colleagues, like for instance, in the San Gabriel, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy has been supportive. So it is consistent to support these two bills. We just didn't include them earlier because of not the direct nexus with the park district, but I think it would be totally appropriate to support both of them. Peter, I don't know, you might want to say something about the overall idea of the Public Lands Act and lands legislation in general at the federal level.
Sure. This set of bills, right when the park districts, this happened, these 3 bills came together in a House passed bill on February 11th. And so the Senate then quickly introduced this combination of these 3 bills. So it's wholly appropriate for the park district to endorse these first 3 bills here because they're all consistent with, well, I should say the first 2 bills are all consistent with what they're noted. There is momentum to push there's some talk about a lands package, but it's it's taking many different shapes and forms right now. So I'll just leave it at that. Could this set of 6 bills that passed the House pass the Senate? Yes, but it's looking less and less likely with very few legislative working days left before the election. Could happen, but the outlook is 50-50 at the moment, I'd say.
Okay.
Any questions, comments? Okay. Oh, pardon me, Member Lane.
Yeah, so I do have a comment. I don't have any problem with supporting these, and I know Dee was interested in our expanding our support. I think in the past we've tried to be, because there are so many bills, we've tried to, one of the ways we've helped decide which ones to be active on are when there is a nexus, you know, with the park district. So I'm fine with this, but I wouldn't want to see our decisions on bills get too wide because there's so many bills. Okay.
I'm okay with that.
All right. Any questions or comments? Further questions, comments? Moving along to the next one.
Sorry, my mute is sometimes challenging to find. So this is a very, I found to be a very interesting bill because it creates a nexus between the health of firefighters and the air quality for people who are most at risk to COVID. And it also recognizes the need to mitigate for wildfire at this time when both were spending, you know, trillions of dollars of resources dealing with the impacts of COVID and the economic downturn. We can least afford another sort of major issue with wildfire. And then it also points out that the folks that are could be most susceptible to COVID are also susceptible to smoke intake from a wildfire. So essentially, this is a direction to basically the Forest Service at the Department of Agriculture and the National Park Service and other land management agencies within Interior to really assess what precautions they're taking to protect firefighters, to mitigate against forest fire, and also to actually continue the work and make sure that we're removing vegetation. And so there's no funding associated, unless I get that wrong, Peter, but I don't believe there's funding associated with this. This is a report back to Congress and to the other agencies and administration about how to best make sure that these linkages are identified and that there's proper funding to address them.
That's right. I did not see in my review of the bill, did not see any funding linked to it, but it's forward thinking and can become legislation after they get after they get the feedback from the agencies.
Yeah, it's an excellent idea to look into for sure. Many board member comments? Any comments from anyone else? Hearing none. Let's move to HR 7073.
I know Peter will have thoughts on this as well. But essentially, as you recall, back in March, the CARES package of Coronavirus Relief Fund passed, and the Park District did apply for funding within the CARES Act. And the bill itself was silent on special district eligibility. The only sort of barrier for local governments was a service of a population of 500,000. And since we serve 2.7 million, we applied. They accepted the application. The funding went to the counties, And we have not currently pursued the funding from the county, but as a result of the fact that the bill was silent on CARES funding for special districts, this California Special Districts Association and ourselves, and I actually honestly can't tell you which entity of us went first, but started to speak with members of the delegation to make sure that special districts were eligible in future coronavirus relief package, and in particularly should be reimbursed for coronavirus expenditures or expenditures directly related to it. So this legislation would ensure that 5% of future relief funding would be going directly to special districts throughout the country. What we've tried to find out or work on is to see if there are some special districts in other states that could weigh in as much as California has. And we've just recently captured the list of special park districts that came to the forum on the 19th or in 2019. But right now, this bill does not have a companion in the Senate. Senator Harris and Senator Feinstein are both looking at it. I believe there's also a senator from Arizona that may be looking at it. But this would be really positive thing if we could get this enacted. And I don't know, Peter would be better to speak in terms of the possibility of success. But it is something that we at least have some traction and some acknowledgement of the importance of special districts.
So I'll just add a few things. Congressman DeSalme is now a co-sponsor, but Congressman Swalwell, for whatever reason, is not. So we're continuing to talk with them. Just remembering back to our recent conversation, how they wanted to be helpful. I don't understand why they're not on the bill, but that's another thing. In terms of the outlook for the bill, Senator Feinstein is looking at it, considering introducing it. Senator Harris is focused on communicating to her colleagues in letters with Senator Feinstein about the importance of special districts being a part of any next emergency relief bill. And that's where her focus has been. Her focus has been on the Fed municipal liquidity facility and making sure special districts qualify for any additional relief funding. So what's the outlook? Slightly better than 50-50, I would say, in terms of making sure special districts are part of the formula or part of the funding. But more work is going to need to be done. I've been trying to reach out to offices that have parks or have special districts or have a large number of them, such as in Illinois and Texas and Ohio. But I'm just one person here. So I'll just keep making the case, but I need help, and people from these communities can really be powerful messengers to these members of Congress and to senators. So that's the way that's going to happen, I think.
Questions or comments on this?
Well, should we be, or are we communicating with our special district forum peers on this? So Peter has a broader message. He can.
Yeah, we were just talking about that earlier this week, Director Lane, that we got the invitation list for the Park Districts Forum that we hosted last year. And so we will be sending a letter or email to the folks on that list asking for their input to their elected members of Congress and senators.
Okay, good.
Anyone else? I guess, Peter, I would have a question. Do you have any insight into why 5% was chosen? Does that represent anything, or was just, well, it's not a round number, but, sort of a...
5%, I'm sorry, I'm not following you, Dennis.
Well, the special districts would be eligible for 5% of the any further
Overall.
relief funds.
The overall.
And I know they're really giant numbers in these relief
Yeah.
funds, but
I think that was part of a discussion that happened at the staff level with CSDA and some other specific special districts in Congressman Garamindi's district that weighed in with him. They thought that that was sufficient, but I don't know that it is, knowing the need is so great. But sorry, I don't have a better answer. I'll try and find out more for you and circle back.
no, that's okay. I just was wondering if it was just a number that was thrown out there, or if somebody really did some research. And with 2,700 special districts in California and 30,000 nationwide, that's, I know it's not lion's share, but
Yeah.
my math had it more than 5%, but who knows?
Yeah.
But thank you for your work on this, and I think it's a start. So if no one else has any comments,
It's a good marker.
if no one else has any comments, let's move to HR 7095, Invest in America Act.
Okay, and I just would say, Dennis, on that last item, that we also will be reaching out to CARPD and that fine organization. So thanks.
Great, thank you very much. We'll come through.
So, as often occurs in our type of work, this bill has already changed from when we wrote the staff memo, but it is an exciting development. The transportation authorization bill at the federal level should be reauthorized about every 5 years. And what that means is it gives them a chance to kind of reallocate the federal tax dollars that come from your gas tax and some other sources to programming. And so it really does change depending on who is the chair of the committee and who is in the White House. So when this was last visited in, I think it was about 2015, the Congress was of a mind to essentially eliminate active transportation. And in fact, it was the one issue that held up the entire bill in the end. So what the compromise was to take all the former transportation elements that would work for trails and recreational use and put them into one pot of money and give states block grants in that pot of money, and then let the states figure out how to divvy it up. What Representative DeFazio's bill is, it goes back to the old model where it creates separate programs for funding. So for example, active transportation has its own program, transportation alternatives. The recreational trails has its own program. Transportation enhancements has its own program. Safe Routes to School would have its own program. So that's the model that occurred, I think, probably in about the 2000s. There was a senator or a representative, Jim Oberstar from Minnesota, that was really keen on bicycling and walking, as is Representative DeFazio. So he has taken that model and implemented into the transportation rewrite. And the good news is, for all the different categories, it's about a $1.5 billion annual investment into active transportation for 4 years. So it's a very pro green and environmentally sensitive approach to transportation. So it's definitely worth supporting this particular bill. And we Peter reminded Representative DeSaulnier that we did have a visit by Representative DeFazio in the district, so he is familiar with some of our trails. And so that, I think, helped with some of the work Peter did, which I will let him speak to in terms of making sure we were recognized in this bill. But since this bill was introduced and the summary was written, it's actually now being folded into a broader infrastructure package of about 1.5 trillion. This bill is 500 billion. So I think I'll pass it over to Peter to talk about the work that he did with the DeSaulnier's office, and then also maybe this would be the appropriate time to talk about the broader infrastructure package.
Sure. And this goes back to a point Doug was making earlier. I'd like to fold in, I really empathize with Doug's challenges. They are very similar in the US Capitol. And in working with offices and with staff and with members, it's challenging all of us. And so during this House Transportation Bill, it was just that much harder to make the case and get edits to amendments. It's all to say, it worked out. I think the Park District is in a good position going into this bill being considered next week on the House floor, but it was an incredible amount of work and many late nights. All to say, as Eric had noted, the bill covers transportation, energy, broadband, schools, housing. It is bold and focuses on a variety of different important needs for the country. And the question then becomes, what's the Senate going to do with it? And we can get to that in a little bit. I'll just cover quickly. There are 3 programs Eric noted where multi-county special districts are eligible for bike and pedestrian funding. One is the Transportation Alternative Program, and that is funded at $1.5 billion each year for 4 years. There's another program which the Park District is eligible for, active transportation connectivity grants. And that program starts in 2024. They're leaving some lead time in this bill because they know it takes about a year to get programs up and going. So you'll see gaps in when things are funded. There's something called a Community Climate Innovation Grant program that also the Park District is eligible for. The Build Grants program allows for units of local government to be eligible. So all to say, I think the Park District did very well, is doing very well in the transportation bill and this larger infrastructure bill. There's also 2 Living Shoreline Coastal Resilience Grants programs, which I know will be of interest to you as well, that are also included in the bill. Happy to talk more about those, but if people have questions, I'll stop there for now.
Any questions, comments? Hearing none. Go ahead, Peter.
That's all I have. The question becomes what the Senate does with this bill. The House is going to consider this bill next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and pass the bill. And so then the pressure will be on the Senate to take up its transportation bill. They are ready to go, but their bill is only about $289 million over 4 years. And as Eric noted, just the transportation part of the House infrastructure bill is $500 million. So there's a gap that they'll have to work out, and the details do matter. The question becomes, do they just do an extension of the current transportation program until after the election? I think that is looking more likely, but there's a real desire to pass a transportation bill and pass a water resources bill before the election. So as I hinted at before, there's not a lot of legislative days left. The Senate will be out for the first 2 weeks of July, back for 3 weeks, and then out for another 4 weeks. So there's not a lot of legislative days left before around October 3rd, they break for the election. So I'll stop there.
All right, Member Lane.
The funds that we would be eligible for this, if something happened with the House bill, are essentially active transportation, is correct?
That's correct. and these coastal resilience living shoreline grants as well.
And I believe the recreational trails program as well, which is very challenging funding to get because everything's been focused on active transportation. It's hard to get, you know, sort of the old traditional trail money.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back a little bit and ask, is there anything left for transportation enhancements, which used to appear in this bill? Anybody else remember that?
Do you remember, I forget how it was classified, Beverly, but try and summarize it this way. This House transportation bill has about, just on the trail side, has about 6 or 7 pots of money that the Park District could compete for. There is three programs that have the words multi-county special district in there. So they really focused, interestingly, and a lot of these programs on gaps in trails and areas where there was congestion. And so if the Park District is to put together a grant request or application, I think you'll be very competitive in any one of these grant programs, especially the ones where the earlier ones, like the first 3 I talked about. So this is like transportation enhancement 2.0. It's way better.
There's no historic preservation kinds of things that they used to have.
I didn't need to go back and take a look at the book on the historic preservation piece. It's a good question.
And Peter, that goes back to the 4F requirements, the 4F requirements on projects.
Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah. It's a good bill. People are quibbling about details, but it is forward thinking, and I could see it being part of a stimulus bill late next year, late at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, if it's just becomes a transportation focus. These are the kinds of things a new administration might really want to pick up and run with.
Great. Well, let's hope for the best on that one. If there's no further questions, let's move to S 3624 and HR 6702, the Pandemic Response and Opportunity through National Service Act.
Yeah, and that's a good segue from what Peter just said, and we'll go through these without super high level of detail, but basically there's a series of bills now that have been introduced in the COVID world that expand opportunity for community service and things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, in this case AmeriCorps and other national service positions. And so I think we identified 2 or 3 of them for this committee meeting, and I anticipate there being more. And should there be a change in the administration, these are the kinds of things that people will run with. It's a way to get people employed, and it's also a way to do great things for the community and the environment. And in this bill's particular case, it's primarily focused on the issue of dealing with the health emergency. So it's expanding the positions in AmeriCorps and some of the other programs quickly in order to provide more healthcare services. And you see here on the list the other things that it does. So I think many of these bills could benefit the district. This one's a little less direct, but I think it's worthy of support. When we get to the one about the Conservation Corps, that one I would say would have a very much of a direct nexus to the Park District.
And just to comment that that some of these things may not have a direct nexus to the district, but some of our partners, we do obviously do have a lot of partnerships with cores, both state and local.
Yeah, questions, comments, anyone?
Well, you know,
Okay, I guess my only,
I just think this is a great idea. And when we're looking now at how much unemployment there is with a sector of our demographics who could fit into this, I just think it's something that would be important for us to support.
I agree fully. I think there's so much work that can be done in the Park District and so much good quality work and so much entry level work. And I think it's a win-win-win for sure. I hope it works out. If there are no other comments, we'll move to the more specific one. S3684, the 21st Century Conservation Corps for Our Health and Our Jobs Act.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see this bill. Obviously, Senator Wyden from Oregon, they have a lot of public land and a lot of, every state's being hit with COVID, but I know that they have some challenges in their rural communities there. So I think he's introduced this as a more of a comprehensive package that would, it touches on a lot of areas, including the Land and Water Conservation Fund. But it basically provides billions of dollars for a new civilian conservation corps and mostly for land management work. And so it's exciting to see it. Often when we've seen corps bills in the past, they've been a little more generic. This does seem to be primarily focused on land management and forestry. So I think we should support it, but I also think we need to, this is the kind of thing that capitalize on the momentum if we can and try to work it through Senators Harris and Feinstein and maybe see if we can find somebody in the House to introduce it. But Peter, I don't know if you might want to say a little bit about these overall efforts on establishing job creation programs.
There's been a collective effort to introduce bills that could be part of the COVID emergency relief bills, or in the next infrastructure bill or the next stimulus bill. It could be, they can take many different shapes and forms. Senator Wyden was hearing a lot from his outfitters and guides in Oregon, especially this summer when they all make their money, and thought, as he worked with his staff, realized there's a need across the board. Let's think about this in a much broader sense. And so they folded in, like Eric said, some just excellent pieces into one big bill. It's a lot of money. I think what they're going to try to do is find opportunities to continue to push their bill, whether as an amendment, but also breaking out various pieces and trying to offer those as amendments to upcoming bills. So that's what I can say about this. Most importantly, though, it does have the Conservation Corps language in there as well, which is an important program at the state level that could really employ a lot of people, as we just talked about.
Great. Any other questions, comments from board members or staff?
Love it.
Sounds like an excellent opportunity. I hope we can do it. So if there's no further questions, we have 7 bills. They're working their way in different levels of the federal government. Staff is asking us to recommend to the full board support of all 7 of these bills. We could discuss them further. We've done quite a bit of discussing it already, and great presentations by you two. Thanks very much. Do I have a motion to move support?
So moved.
A motion from member Eccles
Second.
and a second by member Lane. Yuli, do we have anybody commenting from outside? If there are no further discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
That is a unanimous aye vote. Thank you both very much for your presentations. And we'll move on now to the federal response to COVID-19. Peter?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I think we've covered a lot of it in some of the other bills that we've discussed, but I did want to give Peter an opportunity to comment if there's anything in addition to the sort of the infrastructure and stimulus bills that we've already talked about, and we talked about the climate in Washington a little bit too. Is there anything to add to that, Peter?
Sure. I'll just cover, just so people remember, the House HEROES Act, which was a $3 trillion bill that included $1 trillion for state and local funding. That passed on May 15th. The Senate is not decided on their approach to the next stimulus bill. I tend to call that, in my vernacular, the Phase 5 bill. The White House is starting to engage on what it would like to see in a Senate bill. The Senate has said it would like to see a bill around $1 trillion. But if you look at the need and where their focus is, they're going to wait for maximum leverage and wait until the end of July. That's when the unemployment benefits expire. And it's unfortunate that we're waiting this amount of time because the need is great, but that's the path that we're currently on. There's a deep split amongst Senate Republicans on what to do on state and local funding. There is a camp of Senate Republicans that deeply believe there is a big need for states and localities and that they need money and they need money now. There are others that believe that any more money to states and localities would be a bailout for states that have not been run well. And so oftentimes the state of Illinois or other states is put up because they've got pension or deficit issues. I won't go down that road anymore, except to say there's a split, and so they're at a stalemate at the moment on what Senator McConnell and his colleagues would like to do. They're working behind the scenes with the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and Secretary Mnuchin's reaching out to Senate Democrats as well. I think there's two factors that are weighing on members. There's the spike in COVID cases, which is making them rethink what else they need to do in a relief bill. And then the economic conditions continue to evolve, and that is weighing on members. Like I noted, the Senate is going to be out for a bit, so this is all going to happen, if they get together, between July 20th and July 31st. And so that's the state of play, but there's people want to add in more money for the Small Business Payment Protection Program. There's others, there's a large consensus that the unemployment benefit program needs to be extended, but that expires on July 31st. There's many people that weighed in on state and local funding. And then there's the kind of public health funding that is needed too to deal with the current pandemic. I think it's going to be over $1 trillion, but that's what Senate Republicans are saying at the moment. So hopefully they can come together here soon. But my best assessment right now is it's going to happen at the end of July, not any sooner.
All right. Any comments?
Well, so
Questions?
if we want to follow this more closely, Peter, where do you recommend that we try and get news?
I will send you a couple of links and I'll send you an article from today that talked about state and local funding. It'll send you a couple of links. Strange thing is, Beverly, sometimes the business channels like CNBC and Bloomberg News they're on this state and local funding issue before anybody else.
Oh, really?
Yeah, strangely enough. But then there's other outlets too. So I'll send you some ones so everybody can follow along if they want to. But CNBC.com or Bloomberg.com, sometimes they're throughout the day covering the issue. The Federal Reserve has a municipal liquidity fund. They are providing loans they have set aside $35 billion. And so the state of Illinois has gotten a loan from the Fed. I know some other states have also gotten a loan. These are not grants, these are loans. But the Fed is getting a lot of criticism from Senate Republicans for doing this. But they're going ahead with it. So that's, again, another outlet to consider.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So let's move to something really good, the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Yes.
Yay.
Yeah, and I'll let Peter speak to it, but I think the timeline is also the end of July, so we'll have to see how crowded the Senate council looks. But Peter, why don't you go ahead and comment on it?
Sure. The House is set to vote on this bill, the Great American Outdoors Act, which includes permanent funding of $900 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and $9.5 billion over 5 years for the public lands maintenance backlog. So that would cover a variety of public lands, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Forest Service. I can get into the 2020 politics and why I think this got across the finish line in the Senate. There were several coastal senators that spoke up, wanting to make the case that more funding needs to go to coastal states where the population lives. And the bill, there was lots of statements and speeches given for about a week on that issue. And it's something I think is not going to go away. And I think those senators are going to come back and want to change this bill, assuming it becomes law, and change the formula so that more money goes to coastal states. Like I said at the outset, the House is going to take up the bill at the end of July, not likely to have amendments or to be changes to it. So if it does pass the House, it would then go to the president and potentially be signed if the president doesn't change his mind. So trajectory is looking positive at the moment.
Yeah, I think your last statement was the key there. So
yeah.
At the moment.
One other thing I can mention, a big announcement will happen on Tuesday in the House. The House established a select committee on the climate crisis and will be issuing a 500-page report and set of recommendations on all kinds of different things that can be done legislatively to address the climate change crisis. And so that will be announced by Speaker Pelosi along with members of that select committee on Tuesday. There was statements made last December by the Speaker that in 2020, the House would take up and pass a climate change bill. There's now questions because of the pandemic and infrastructure bill and police reform legislation that is there enough time to do that? There's been some work done by committees on climate change legislation, but maybe not enough to be ready to do a bill. I don't know. It depends on how things go. So my assessment is that some of these recommendations could be picked up at the end of the year or beginning of next year and could be part of a climate change bill, comprehensive bill. But there's a whole section in there on public lands and carbon storage and resilience and coastal protections. I think we'll like it.
Fantastic. Any other questions, comments? Well, I just remember that when I first came to this park district, full funding on land and water conservation fund were the mantra, and we, at some point I thought, we're going to keep banging our heads against the wall, but it looks like it's through a lot of hard work. It looks like it might happen, and boy, we're sure going to benefit from that, and I'm very, very happy. So thanks for all your work, Peter, and everybody else. I guess you're going to sign off, Peter, right, Peter? Or you're welcome to stay. We're moving on to some of our work here in the Park District, but thank you very much for your report, and Doug also.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great, fantastic. In that case, we'll move on.
And Dennis, I just wanted to recognize, Peter and myself, honestly, and our general manager been working on land and water for 30 years, 40 years, whatever. It is really a great thing to see. And I know it's been a very important thing to the agency, and Bob and Pat's leadership on it has been really important. And we should also acknowledge Dave Wyman, who a longtime advocate for this to come to pass. So knock on wood that the president stays by his tweets.
Huh.
We can only hope for the best.
And believe it or not, we have been here before, and we got all the positive signs even during the Clinton administration, and then there was a hiccup there. So we can't let up. The advocacy should not let up. There are just so many dynamic things going on right now that could be a distraction for getting this over the finish line. So we've got to continue to advocate for this in every chance we get.
All right. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll move along to the impacts of the coronavirus on the East Bay Regional Park users and information analytics. Lisa, Eric?
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks, Dennis. So first of all, I want to acknowledge Yuli Padmore's work on this presentation, and also recognize that she is now our acting legislative assistant. So we're very happy to have her in that role. And also wanted to acknowledge Lisa Baldinger's support on this presentation and helping come up with this survey instrument. So, we all know how slammed our parks are and how busy we've been. And so for government affairs, our job is to, harness that knowledge into advocacy. And in order to do that, we've been looking at a number of ways to scientifically demonstrate what we're saying in terms of how important we are to people's mental health and physical health, and how we should be considered essential service, and how resources, emergency resources, should come to parks. So in order to quantify that, so that in a year from now, when we're in Washington, hopefully, and we're trying to demonstrate how busy we were, and they say, well, yeah, I don't really remember, we'll have some data and some other information to share with them. So that was kind of the driver behind putting a survey instrument in the field in May 11th through May 18th. It was an N of 500. And so this is the result of that, that instrument. So next slide, please. So this was a very important question from our general manager. How important is it to have regional parks and trails open during the coronavirus pandemic? And you can see there we had a 96% important. So I think it's proven us to be on the right side of history with numbers like that. Next slide, please. And then, we want to know if this is going to have a lasting impact. So when the coronavirus is over, will you be using parks the same or more? And 94% say yes, and with a 40% there of even greater role. So I think that means that, we've been the only game in town, but we're going to continue to be something that people use even when this is all over. Next slide. And then this question was how important having access to parks has been. 90%, not too much dissimilar than the first question. Next slide. And then the decision to keep parks open. It was a hard decision at the time, but 90% of the public agreed that it was the right thing to do. So again, right side of history. Next slide, please. And I guess I should say on that, acknowledge the board's fortitude and strength and the general manager's commitment to keeping parks open. I know from being on a lot of those calls and those meetings that was not an easy thing for any of us to do. But I think the public's really, these numbers show the public's really appreciated it and supported, and that we continue to have their trust in doing so. I think Yuli, could you go back? Yeah, thanks. And so here's the good question for Peter. 79% say the park should be considered an essential service during a pandemic. So the health order said we provide essential activity, but in terms of the federal designation of an essential service, we're not officially there. But this pandemic gives us a strong case to make that pitch in our advocacy in Washington, and we'll continue to do that. Okay, next slide. And then should we be eligible for emergency funds? I think this applies both to state and federal. So 75% say yes. So, when we're talking about Garamendi's bill, this is a data point for him to reference. Next slide. And then this is where I hand it over to Lisa.
All right. So early on, when the decision making was happening regarding keeping parks open or shut, we were seeing on some of our social media accounts, well, it's easy to keep a park open, it's just a dirt trail. And we all know that our parks are so much more than dirt trails, it's the people that make them possible. And so this survey question was on awareness of the role of our employees and during the coronavirus pandemic. And so you can see 90% saw that it was important, and we do. This came after our public affairs team launched their public education campaign, which is featured on the left side of this screen, the I Am EBRPD, where we've been educating on all of our social media platforms who our park employees are and what their role contributes to keeping these parks open and safe during the COVID response. Next slide, please. All right, and this is requesting similar to Eric's questions that he shared, but just collecting a whole breadth of information prior to the coronavirus pandemic. How often do you visit parks or trails? And so often those are our daily users, our people who get out every day. Sometimes is our weekend users, and then rarely is who we think about to be our special occasion users. So coming out on certain holidays or family events. And so ultimately, that's about 93% were visiting the trails prior to the coronavirus. And as Eric's slide shared, about 40% are saying that it's going to increase in their frequency after. So those sometimes and those rarelys might shift up to regular visitors. Next slide, please. As we all are well aware, we've been working hand in hand with our health departments, our county health departments. And so we were curious the awareness of this. The image at the top is a PSA that we did in partnership with the county health, but the survey was administered prior. And so prior to doing any sort of public education on our partnership with the county health departments, 44% were aware that we were working with the county health departments. And of those 44, about 40%, 39% felt it did impact their decision about whether or not parks should be kept open during the pandemic. However, some of those no's might have said, well, regardless of your conversations there, I think parks should be open. And so this is a little working out the details there in the crosstabs, but ultimately just letting people know who we're working with to make these areas possible during this time. Next slide, please. All right, the most common reason for visiting the parks, one could argue that these are all synonyms, but this really helps us with the engagement with the language that we use on our social media, on our commercials, in our brochures. And so the top result for the past few surveys that we've done has consistently been walking. So whether you're walking up a steep trail in Redwood or you're walking around Lake Chabot, that's a potential response, followed closely by hiking, active recreation, and then health and wellness was also a high response there. Next slide, please. All right, and with this, I'm going to turn it back to Eric. We also want to dive into the fear and anxiety that individuals are experiencing. This survey was administered in May, so this will be likely something that we repeat in future surveys to get some longitudinal information. So with that, I'll hand it back to Eric.
And I don't imagine that this is a surprising number to anyone, but 85% of the public thinking, having some level of fear and anxiety on health, well-being, and also economic stability. So it just demonstrates just how real this situation is. Next slide. And then this was one that I actually found powerful. The question about what role or what level of anxiety do you have about your health, mental and physical? So 52% saying the anxiety is both equally mental and physically, but 40% are saying just mental. So that's 92% that say mental is part of it, but 40% it's the main concern. And then of that, do you think it's going to be short-lived or long-term? 74% think it's going to have a long-term impact. So that's a huge, in my mind, if you see that number of 92% on the mental and 74% lasting effects, that means that this is a very, very long-lasting, significant event that we're all living through, as we know. Next slide. So how important will it be? We're talking about phasing things in. I'm not so sure. It feels like we're running with things, not necessarily phasing. But at any rate, the question was, how important would it be for parks to stay open while things get phased in? So we still don't have large gatherings, at least in California, where there'd be like a sporting event or concert. So having parks open is still important for 94% of the public that were surveyed. Next slide. And then we wanted to ask the question about spending, your spending habits. Now, this was mid-May. I'm not sure if we asked this question now, if we would have this high number, 54%. But the fact that 37% we're going to cut back in mid-May, that's a pretty significant number, given that's like 3 times or at least twice the unemployment rate. So that's a big number. Next slide. Then asking the question in the middle of a pandemic about should government be spending more on parks, kind of a challenging question to ask, but without any real context other than the previous questions you saw. 53% are saying yes, that there should be more, we should be investing more money into parks. Next slide. And then this is kind of the willingness to pay for the individual and their family. And even again with this, without a lot of contacts, 50% were willing to pay more for the number of parks and trails available to them. And then I think I hand this, oh no, I'm doing this. So I found this to be very interesting. We listed 10 spending priorities, and of the 10, the number one that jumped out, and it kind of aligns with what we talked about earlier in the conversation about Job Corps, was that the highest priority was to create a summer Job Corps for local youth for park work. And we also included the urban parks in that question because it would be for both. And then obviously, increasing more activity for youth. Having both of those in the 80 to 90% range really shows a strong interest in making sure that we have activity for younger people in the summer. Then hand washing stations, visitor use facilities and restrooms. Those are interesting to see the restrooms below the hand washing stations, but that is still expected number on the restrooms. And then improving access. That actually that 65% I think actually may be lower than normal. I think that number is usually in the 70s. So next slide, please. And I believe this is now Lisa.
All right, continuing on investments that we asked from those who were polled. We asked about modifying picnic areas to allow for space between socially distancing bubbles. That was followed by water bottle filling stations has lessened. Hand washing stations was significantly higher on the survey. So you can see that shift in priorities, understandably. Increasing and improving parking for those who maybe live further from parks or further from a park that they enjoy the recreation amenities at. Our lower results were expanding aquatics for social distancing in the aquatics facility, and widening trails or building parallel trails to existing trails was a little lower. Next slide, please. So with gyms and other areas for recreation clothing, we did want to ask about daily fitness routine. So again, we're seeing at the top that word walking came in at the highest. Individuals are also working out at home, they're hiking, they're still working out at a gym facility, I believe is what number 3 meant, maybe a personal gym facility, and then running came down at the lowest. Next slide, please. Okay, so with the majority of our surveys now, we also want to understand where people are getting their information from, and those are the channels to then engage in further. And so the top results of the demographics who were surveyed in this specific survey, they are getting the majority of their information from television, followed then at about half the amount with social media or other, with radio, and family, friends, and coworkers is unusually low. So normally in surveys, I mean, with Prop 68, the exit polling showed that people got the majority of their information about Prop 68 from families, friends, and coworkers, but because those water cooler conversations aren't happening anymore, that's taken a significant drop. Next slide, please. So with this, we wanted to share with you, this is a slide from Carol Johnson's presentation on public engagement that was presented at the board meeting a few weeks back. But we wanted to show you just how active individuals are on social media. The demographics of social media, which will be on the next slide, but we'll go ahead and stay on this one for a second, are a little different than the demographics of this poll. And so each point represented in this graph is a point of engagement. So when we released information about park closures, park openings, et cetera, you can see that spike in engagement on our social media channel. This is represented at Facebook. Next slide, please. And then this is a demographic breakout of who those points of engagements are. So that high point, the majority of individuals who engage there are 25 to 34. So our millennial generation, followed by 35 to 44, et cetera. You can see the geographic information of where we're getting engagement with Oakland and then followed by Santa Clara and San Francisco, that are maybe individuals who are wondering when can they come to our region to use our parks, but hopefully are hiking close to home right now, Alameda, Berkeley, et cetera. And then at this time, we are getting the majority of our engagement on Facebook. So that's just in terms of where we would put information soonest, fastest, and broadest, that would be the channel we would go through. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we just wanted to share the demographics of this survey relative to Facebook. The result of the N of 500 individuals who were surveyed, about 68% were white and Caucasian. The majority of them do own their properties and have lived there for over 25 years, and currently do not have school-age children at home. With their age range, the majority of age range is over 65, so sort of the opposite of those Facebook demographics on the previous slide, slanting downwards. So we did want to highlight that in terms of taking into consideration relative to the results today. So, and with that, that concludes our presentation, and I think we can open up for questions. Thank you. very much. Muted, Director Wasby.
Questions, comments? Sorry. Anyone?
Wow, I think this is fascinating stuff.
Robert?
Members of the board, there's a lot more information to dig into on this. This is a very dense, densely informative, I won't say dense, densely informative presentation, and there's a lot there to dig into. I think we had just a couple of comments. We've always had a fairly big following and use of our parks from people from San Francisco. It's the biggest city. It's a very, very urban city. And so people really love to come to the East Bay and use our parks. So I'm not at all surprised about that. We also have a fairly big constituency going to Mission Peak that's Santa Clara oriented. I know that Dennis certainly has noticed the frequent comments from the city of Fremont saying those other people coming to our parks from that county called Santa Clara. But it's right on our boundary, and it really is. They're not part of the district's population, but they're certainly a part of a statewide population that votes for bond measures in parks. So important to just be aware of that. Other things, I think you're probably aware, but there's been some really good data now starting to come out of the COVID crisis from other doctors and research, that the level of infection, not just on seniors, but in Black and brown population, as well as everybody else, is the direct relationship to metabolic health and to the infection. And I think that goes back to the messaging that we've now been doing on healthy parks, healthy people, and on physical activity. And I really appreciate Eric's comment on the mental health. It's something that both county health directors really pushed us on from day one, because we're going, you need parks for exercise. And they were right there going, part of our responsibility is we are also the health directors for mental health in the counties. And so the mental health aspect of the parks is critical. And I think that's something we should be giving more thought about. You all know it, when you get outside, get in nature, you feel better, whether you walked a lot or not, you just feel better. So I think it's also a place where for decades, people work out their issues and having conversations. I will include myself with my wife, get out and walk and get outside and resolve some of the issues you haven't talked about. And so there's just a whole benefit from parks. But I do really think what we haven't talked about since the board's resolution over the George Floyd murders and the protests is that we really do have to think about the health of those populations and what we do for them, mental and physical. And I think it's really important that we spoke out. I think it's really important that we do more. But we also have to remember that, as was really clear, I happen to have been a founding board member of the East Bay Conservation Corps, now Civic Corps, and in talking to a lot of the Black and brown kids that came through that program, it was about getting an opportunity to bring a check home to mom who may have been a single mom. I mean, I heard that same story repeated again and again, that 18-year-old son or daughter was a primary income earner for that family sometimes, with additional health issues in those households. So I just really think one of our duties are the jobs. And we know that, we talk about it, but I think if you really want to help, yes, there's a tremendous amount of anger and frustration and a lot of other emotional things going on, but if you really want to help communities, you need to give them an opportunity of hope with a job. And I just think that's a critical thing. Peter didn't mention it, but when you look at the conservation corps, when you look at those legislation, that is a real opportunity for youth to get those summer jobs, just like Dennis said, that's really important. So I just want to keep that in our thoughts legislatively, that providing safe environments that are welcoming environments for new people to get jobs, even as an entry-level job, that those little paychecks are a real source of pride. And our jobs are education as well as a job and a check. And I just think our commitment to youth jobs and employment just has to be foremost in the minds of us moving forward in the future, because I've just heard it so many times. National Parks at GDNRA did a panel with this young Hispanic leader, and you know, they did all these really great comments about why parks are wonderful and why did you choose parks, and this must have been, and he said it was about a job. And you know, that's so obvious and so simple, but it's where we can really help, and to make sure that our barriers, real or perceived, in the park district for minorities wanting to work here, it's just something we got to continue to work on. And I know there's a lot of focus on how people feel and how angry and sad people are, but we can't lose focus on that. We have an opportunity through the legislation you talked about today and elsewhere to provide really good jobs for people and to encourage that. And I think it's just, I feel very strongly about it. And I heard it all day today, and it wasn't said, but I heard it. And that's what you look at these legislative programs that really are an opportunity, whether that's firefighting or recreation or civic corps projects. They really are a way to be an equalizer and to move forward. And I think that's important when we look at our legislative program.
Thank you, Bob. Any questions or comments about the survey? I guess everyone's had an opportunity to speak. Oh, pardon me, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank staff for the survey. I thought it was fascinating. So thank you very much for your work there. And I also want to strongly express my support for youth jobs. It's just so critical on so many levels, because one, it gets people to get in and actually see what the opportunities are here, and you know, also get some training so that then they can get those permanent jobs. And so, you know, I think the challenge really is how do we recruit, and how do we find those people? All those folks are out there, a whole huge diverse community. So I mean, that's really the challenge, to get folks in the door, and the youth programs and the youth jobs are a big part of that. So I definitely would like to see more money and more legislative activity focused on that. In addition to the
Elizabeth,
Conservation Corps. I mean, I love the overall Conservation Corps, but I particularly also care about the youth aspect.
And Elizabeth, I just want to comment on that again, is that I just had a call with the executive director of the Civic Corps, and they are talking about some of this legislation as well, and that foundations want to fund their efforts on social equity and employment. And I think they already have a system in place that they can scale up, that's really focused on younger people of color, and really focused on what they need in services. Like they have 2 counselors that are permanent in Civic Corps for young people. And I was talking about what's going on now. So I think one of the things to do is also remember to really support the non-district employment as well, who work in the district, but they're not our employees. And they just have a whole system set up to bring people in. And they bring them in at a very young age, and they provide education as well. And I just don't want to lose that partnership because they can scale up. They don't have to do anything. They just need more money to fund more jobs. And it's a great partnership.
Thank you. Well, go ahead, Eric.
I just wanted to add to what both Director Eccles and General Manager said, that, you know, this survey was taken before the George Floyd incident, and summer jobs still hold the highest. So I think that there is a window here to really advocate for that. And I know, Director Eccles, you were on the call that we had with Barbara Lee, where she seemed very interested in taking this issue and advancing it in some kind of a job stimulus package. And at the time, it was a little less clear where the federal priorities were going to be. But I think we may want to re-engage with her office on that, not only for the idea of a federal jobs corps, but I think to what General Manager is saying is that, you know, recognizing the partnership and recognizing the need to funding and recognizing the need that they can scale up. I think that's a communication that we need to have with her office. And so Peter and myself and Lisa will be working on that. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is that we've also recognized how we're communicating or listening, either way. And we're doing a deep examination along with Carol Johnson in Public Affairs about how we talk. And I know Lisa's basically leading that for government affairs, but we're working directly with Carol and her team to make sure that we are engaging in the communities that we serve. And I know we mentioned at the end of the survey that the demographics that took that survey are not the demographics that we're talking about right now. And so we want to figure out how do we learn more from the folks that didn't answer that survey. And so that's something that we're taking very seriously and beginning work on. Well, actually, we've already kind of begun work on it. So we may be working with UC Davis on some of that, as well as with Carol's team. Just wanted to let you know that it's definitely on our radar.
So Eric, and Chair Dennis Waspy, if you can indulge me with this 1 minute longer, because I did want to also ask, so how were those 500 people identified for that survey? Because I think that's a really good point to make sure that we're really getting the full spectrum of the community in terms of the surveys.
Lisa, you want to take that one?
The N of 500 was voters and non-voters. However, this specific surveyor does their surveys over landlines. And so it was individuals who had landlines installed, which is likely why we got homeowners and others. And so we do have a survey advancing in the near future that will build off of previous surveys, but be over a variety of mediums. So we saw in the Park and Public Interest survey that we did in 2019, where we just did a non-scientific widespread survey, that the top number of users completed the survey over their cell phone. And so we want to provide that avenue in future scientific surveys. And so we're working with a consultant to do a survey that's text to survey, landlines, and just a variety of mediums to see how the results will fare moving forward.
Great. That's good stuff. Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys both for doing this, and thanks for having the foresight to do this during this time. And, you know, my only comment would be, or I have a number of comments, but I think I've shared them with Eric and Lisa before, but this survey was done between May 11th and May 18th. I'd really like to see and I hope there is a follow-up, and I'd love to see the question, should parks be considered essential services? And I'd love to see, if they were asked that on September 18th, that 11% that said no and the 10% that said undecided, I bet that would change immensely. And I think a number of those questions would lean more to the value of parks. And I look forward to a follow-up if we can do that. So anyway, thanks again. Our next item is the articles. We have a whole list of articles, and thanks staff for sending those out all the time. I personally like the article from Catherine Nagel, the first article of the group that just said how essential parks were and how they were so needed, and historically, Frederick Law Olmsted understood that years and years ago, and the value just continues to be so great to societies and well-being of everybody. So thanks for those. Any other comments on any articles, Eric?
And it's just on that point, and I won't belabor it, but Catherine, I know, is the City Parks Alliance, but we've had conversations with NRPA, and I think both of those entities are actually going to be advocating for federal legislation to make parks considered to be essential.
All right. Anyone else on the articles? If nothing else, we've come to open public comments. Yuli, do we have any public comments?
No public
Okay.
comments.
All right, then let's move to board comments. Board members have any comments? Hearing none. It's, well, geez, it's 3 o'clock. We've overshot it again. That's because there's so much great information. I want to thank you all very much. Eric, Lisa, and especially Yuli, thank you for making this work. And thank you guys for having the foresight to suggest that we'll go down the history. This is the first committee meeting via Zoom, right? Are we going to still grab that honor or hope for that honor? Okay. Well, I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you thought of it, and I'm glad we're doing it. So everybody have a great weekend. Santa Cruz is open. Let's go to the beach. Or maybe not. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.